Hi there, in this video I'm going to show you how we can connect external data sources to your real-time graphics using Erizos Studio and the tools in UI Builder, more specifically the data binding tools. So just to show you what we're going to achieve by the end of this video, here I have a Google Sheet with player information. Here I have my template where I can select one of the players. You'll see that this drop-down corresponds to the data I have in my Google Sheet. I can select any of the players and hit take in, and you'll see that our graphics update. Let's do that with a different player, and there you see my graphics are updating accordingly. So let's jump into UI Builder and see how we can build this out. Okay, so here I have my player infographic that I want to populate from my external data source. I'm going to right click on the page and select Edit UI to open up UI Builder and create a new custom user interface for this template. In this demo, I'm not going to be using all the exposed fields, so I'll remove what I don't need. And let's go ahead and add a drop-down, which will be the player selection component. Okay, now I need to go ahead and set up my data sources. So in the left menu, we have the data sources menu. And this has three different sections. The first is the data source, then we have the data feeds and the data variables. And throughout this video, I'm going to explain what each one does. We're going to start with the data source. So the data source is your connection to your data, external data source. So you click plus, and in the create source modal, we select what our data source is. So I'm going to be selecting Google Sheets, and I'll give it a name, GS for Google Sheets and players. And now I can go ahead and grab my Google Sheet URL and paste that in to the property over here and hit create. So I've now set up the connection to Google Sheets and the Google Sheet that I want to use. Next thing we're going to do is set up a data feed. So data feed is a subsection of our data basically. So I'm going to create a new feed and select the Google Sheet players as my source, and let's give this a name, players. And here, for example, this is what I mean by a subsection of the data. Say, for example, I only need the name and the position. So I can do columns B to C. And we'll get a preview of our selected data, of our data query, basically. I'm going to leave the players empty. I'm just going to grab all the data. But once we get to hooking up the country and the country flag, you'll see how these data feeds can become extremely useful. So I'll go ahead and create that. And finally, I need to create a variable. A variable is basically the selected row from our data source to our data feed. So there's two ways we can create the data variables. We can either hit click plus and then select our variable, our data feeds, or I can right click on the data feed and select create variable. And that will already set up that feed parameter for us. I'm going to name this player, as every time they'll hold an individual player. And in the advanced sections, we have a few options. So the index, if you come from a data background, is basically the unique key that we're using to select the data. If you don't have a unique key in your data, you can just leave this as index, which is an auto-generated index provided for you. But if you need to use a specific ID, for example, in my data, I have this number, this unique number for each player. I can go ahead and select number. And that's what we'll be using basically to find the players. Okay. The other thing we have here is to auto update the data. So we can set this to live and the interval of time when to pull the new data from the data source. This is great if you're using stock data or weather data or anything that's updating frequently. I'm just using static data, so I'll leave this turned off. And once we've set up our variable, we can go ahead and click create. And now we have that variable. We can now start hooking up our data. So in our drop-down field here, we have the items, and this I want to list all our players basically to let the user select the player that they want. So I'm going to be selecting the variable, okay, and the key that I'm going to be using is the number of the player. And I'm going to leave this as auto and show you what each of these three display properties do. So if we leave it as auto, and click save, go into preview mode, it's just going to automatically show us the number of our the number for each player in our drop down. Now that's not very useful because the operator probably won't know what which number corresponds to which player. So we can go ahead and edit our binding here and set it to property. So let's select the name, go back into preview mode, and now each player shows up as a name, which is a lot more user-friendly. We can also do something even more user-friendly for the graphics operator to select the player. Let's say, for example, we want to show the player's name and their position. So we can start typing the curly brackets in our format string here and select any of the properties that we want. Select name, and we'll add a little dash here, and then their position. And anything outside of the curly brackets are basically free text for you to write. So if I now go into the preview mode, we can see we get each player name with their position, which is super helpful for the operator to know which graphic they want to select. Okay, so now we've set up the our selection tool. We can go ahead and start binding up each of our fields here. So for the position, I'll right-click the value, create binding, and say we want the player variable, and we just want to have their position. And for the country, let's leave the country alone for a second. We'll get into that in a second. Create binding for the age. And for their name as well, we can just go ahead and create that binding. And let's go ahead and hit save. So now when I select one of these players, you can see the position updated, their age updated, and the name. Let's select a different player, and there you see it's working. Okay, now for the country and the country flag. So inside Media Hub, I have all the country flags by code here. It's already populated for me. And in our data source, we have a new sheet called countries. And this has the country name and their code. So I basically, in my player data, I have the nationality or the country for each player. And I want to bind that to this sheet and get the country code, which corresponds to the country. So the way that I can do this in UI Builder using our data binding is very easy. So I'm going to start off by creating a new data feed. I'm going to use the Google Sheets players data source, and I'm going to name this countries. Now, this is where the subset of our data can come in super handy. I'm going to put in here countries, and I want columns A to B. And you can now see that I'm pulling from the countries sheet inside our spreadsheet, columns A and B, which is the country and the code. Let's go ahead and create. And now I'm going to create a variable from this feed. So I'm going to name this country. I can leave the, the index I'll set to country and set create. Okay. Now instead of a field here, I'm going to put in a drop down. I'm going to bind the drop down just like we did with the players to our country variable. And just show the country name. And this is where the cool part happens. I'm going to bind the value to our player variable, and I'm going to get their nationality. So what's happening is when I select a player, it will update the player variable, and then I'll have the player's nationality. That's going to update this drop down and then select that country automatically for us. And then finally I need to hook up the image over here. So in the value, I'm going to go create binding. I'm going to select the country, and I want to have a special format because I need to change the country code that I have here to our Media Hub path. So I'm going to copy this. And this is where you see this formatting option comes in very handy. I'm going to select the country code and add the file extension as well. And click OK. Last thing I need to do is relink this country field to our graphics. And we should be good to go. Let's just do a quick dry run and see that everything's updating as expected. So here we have the Spanish flag and the flag of Uruguay, the US flag. So our data is updating correctly. We can go ahead and save this now, jump back into Studio. Let's bring up our engine. Let's select one of our players here and hit take in. And you can see that the flag is updated, the position, the country, the player's name. Let's select a different one. Hit take in. And you can, there you go, see that everything's updating as expected. So that's how you can use our data binding tools inside UI Builder to quickly link up external data sources to your graphics. Thanks for watching.